After World War II, the country of Vietnam won their independence from France after the Indochina War. The new country of Vietnam now had two opposing political forces which were at war. The International Geneva Conference decided to split Vietnam into the Democratic Republic of North Vietnam, which was communist, and the Republic of South Vietnam, which was democratic. The leader of South Vietnam ran a very corrupt government. The Viet Cong, a South Vietnam communist group, rebelled against the government with help from North Vietnam. President Dwight D. Eisenhower had offered help to South Vietnam, as America feared that communism would spread to other countries in Asia. This was referred to as the domino effect. At first, the United States sent only advisors to South Vietnam to train their armed forces. America became more involved in the war, eventually sending thousands of soldiers and sailors to Vietnam. In 1965, a Villanova College student, Joseph Robertson, took a year off from school to figure out what he wanted to do. During this time, the war in Vietnam was escalating, and the draft was intensifying. One night he came home to find a letter from the Selective Services saying that he was drafted. He reported for duty on September 29, 1965. Joe was sent to Fort Gordon in Georgia for basic training and given an MOS, Military Occupational Specialty in Infantry. After completing basic infantry training, he was sent to Fort Ord, California for advanced individual training in infantry. Joe knew that infantrymen were needed in Vietnam and being sent overseas was now undeniable. However, of the 172 men in his training unit, 170 of them were sent directly to Vietnam. Joe was one of the two who were sent to Germany. Joe landed in Germany and was assigned to the 2nd Armed Cavalry. He was given the job of a tank driver, even though he did not have his driver's license. The executive officer, Lieutenant Swift, convinced Joe to attend Officers Candidate School, OCS, a 6-month course in Fort Benning, Georgia. The course consisted of intense physical and classroom training. Joe said it was basic training cubed. On February 8th, he graduated and was sent to Fort Dix, New Jersey, as a second lieutenant of a basic training company. He understood that he would go through several cycles of training new soldiers, but eventually would be sent to Vietnam to lead an infantry unit. While at Fort Dix, the luckiest thing happened. Joe broke his glasses and went to the dispensary to get new glasses. The doctor told him that his vision was far too bad to be in infantry. Joe recalled it as one of the best things that ever happened in his life. Joe was offered several options within the Army: administration, intelligence, or finance. He decided to transfer to finance because he always liked numbers and it sounded interesting. His new orders were go to Fort Eustis, Virginia, and to be their payroll officer. After several months, the Army realized that Joe was never trained as a payroll officer. They sent him to Fort Benjamin Harris in Indiana for an 8-week training course. In November, he received orders to go to Vietnam. Joe was not surprised or bitter since he figured he was going to end up in Vietnam before his tour of duty was over. In 1968, right after New Year's Day, Joe left for Vietnam. He flew out of San Francisco on a civilian plane for his 24-hour flight. The plane landed at Saigon at the Tan Son Nhut Air Base. Joe had no idea what to expect as he boarded the truck at the airport. The truck took him to his new assignment at the 9th Infantry Division base called Bearcat. This was the base camp of the 9th Infantry Division, whose main job was to support the Navy's Task Force 117, riverboats which patrolled the Mekong Delta. Joe's job was to ensure that every man in the division was paid on time and at the right salary. There were 30 payroll clerks within the division, but the payday was always hectic. Joe was flown by Huey helicopter to all the bases, even after payday, to ensure that everyone had been paid. The men were paid in U.S. currency, Vietnamese money, or script. Mostly they were paid in script, military money that had no real value outside the military post. If they were going on R&R, they would be paid in U.S. currency. If they were going to Saigon or some other destination within Vietnam, they were paid in local currency. He was also in charge of converting the manual payroll to an automated payroll. The computers were giant and easily filled a room. They had to keep the computers inside of trucks because of the extreme weather. There were 2 seasons, the dry season and the monsoon season. During the 6 months of the monsoon season, it rained all day and everything was always flooded. For the other 6 months of the year, it was hot and very dry, and everything was covered with dirt and dust. With this extreme weather, the Army took advantage of the local civilian population and had them start to fill sandbags and perform other necessary tasks around the base. The sandbags were vital to the safety of the men on the base, as they were placed on the perimeter of all the buildings with the bunkers. For every air raid drill, they had to report to the nearest bunker. The bunkers had a wooden base but were covered with sandbags. The men realized that it was only a drill if the red light on top of the flagpole was blinking. Once it was confirmed that it was a drill, the men took their time. On January 31st, 1968, the alarm went off. Someone stuck their head out and realized there was no light. This was the beginning of the 10 Offensive, which was the series of attacks by the northern Vietnamese and Viet Cong to start a rebellion amongst the southern Vietnamese people. The 10 Offensive was not successful, but it was a turning point in the war. Fortunately, Bearcat was not under attack, but Joe witnessed the explosions of the ammunition dump at Long Bend. At Bearcat, they lived in buildings called hooches with 10 men in each of them. Right across from the hooches were their air-raid shelters. After 6 months at Bearcat, a Thai infantry division was taking over. The 9th Infantry Division was moved to Dong Tam on the Meghan River. The Navy had riverboats always patrolling the Meghan River here. At Dong Tam, the housing conditions were not as nice as Bearcat. However, Joe was living with the mess officer who would get them the best foods. They also set volleyball nets up and would play all night long. They also had barbecues on the back parts of the hooches. There was also fewer air raids, but there was also mortar attacks. Mortars were always fired in a straight line, and the enemy could only fire 5 or 6, so it was very predictable where they were going to land. If they were in the middle of a volleyball game and there was a mortar attack, they would scan where the mortars were landing and continue to play the game. After too much of the military script had got out into the Vietnamese economy, Joe was woken at 5 a.m. on a November morning in order to the payroll vaults for what he and the rest of the finance division had been training for. It was C-Day on Conversion Day. This was the day when all the old military script would be converted to new script. Joe's mission was to travel with 6 other soldiers to each of the base camps into the field to make exchanges. C-Day was 48 hours of non-stop action. Joe and his roommates were able to keep up with what was going on at home because his parents sent him a subscription to the Philadelphia Inquirer. Joe and all his roommates were shocked and upset about the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy, as well as the national riots. They were confused and worried about what was going on at home. He believed there was more order in Vietnam than there was at home during this time. Joe left Vietnam in December of 1968 and enrolled at Villanova University through the GI Bill. He started attending classes in January 1969 and pursued a career in accounting. He was never bitter that he had been drafted into the war and others got to stay home. His sole complaint was about the protesters, who believed he was accusing him of being a stooge for the government. He was insulted by this and felt strongly that he had done his duty as a citizen. Although this was a difficult time, Uncle Joe felt he was a very lucky man. He went into the Army as a 20-year-old who was unsure about his future. While in the Army, he matured and saw the world. He had never traveled past the New Jersey shore, but he was able to travel all over Europe, Vietnam, Australia, and Japan. His career in the military carried over to his accounting studies in college, and eventually he became the director of tax department at the Johnson & Johnson companies until his recent retirement. Uncle Joe rarely speaks of his adventures in the Army to friends or family. I am so grateful for him sharing them with me.